I started off with VMware about 2.5 years ago. Came on board to this wild and crazy thing called software-defined networking. And it's been an interesting ride. So if you go back 2.5 years ago, a lot of our customers, when we started talking about software-defined networking, were telling us, wow, this is kind of crazy. Philosophically, we can see that maybe this is, actually has some value added, could be a potential. And we've gone so fast over the past 2.5 years to now, if we look back at 2015, we've pretty much gone mainstream. What I mean by going mainstream with NSX is we're now seeing adoption across a wide group of customers that cover everything from like healthcare to retail to financial services to the banking industry, the insurance industry, even in the federal government as well too. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually how some of our customers have actually taken a practical approach to deploying NSX. So I think one of the unique value adds or one of the unique characteristics around NSX is this is a solution that can exist on top of your existing infrastructure today, right? We're not bound by any physical hardware. So in other words, you don't have to rip and replace any of your existing infrastructure to start leveraging some of the capabilities of NSX overall. So quick show of hands, how many folks have actually know about NSX or have heard of NSX? All right, awesome, cool. All right. So we're all seeing the same thing, right? From an industry perspective, we're all being asked to do more with our IT organizations with less. We're all being asked to do more with security, right? We look at the last 2+ years, the number of security breaches has been paramount, right? And our security spend has been going crazy. And the thing is, our security spend hasn't been keeping up with the number of security breaches that we've seen overall, right? So we need a better idea or a better way of implementing security within the context of our infrastructures. The second thing is, we're being asked to actually move IT along at the speed of business, right? To have that AWS cloud-like speed and agility, if you will, within the context of our own IT organizations, right? So we're putting more and more pressure on our IT organizations overall. Then lastly, right, we also want to make sure that our applications are highly available and essentially any application anywhere can exist, right? So we want to make sure we have that resiliency built into our next generation applications. So we'll talk about how we actually address some of those things. So first, on the security side of the house, if you look at what NSX can provide, we're essentially the platform, if you will, to deliver security within a context as granular as a single virtual machine. Now, why is that important? If I'm backing up every single virtual machine I have in my environment by a stateful firewall, now my risk profile, my surface of attack, if you will, is as small as an individual virtual machine as opposed to a whole entire DMZ. If you look at the way most of the attacks have happened over the past couple of years, most of the security data breaches that have happened over the past couple of years, right? It's been folks coming in through not the traditional mechanism of a perimeter firewall, but coming in through some sort of tertiary entry point to our data center. And then once they gain entry into the data center, it's really easy to start moving around that data center because our data centers are so highly connected overall. So we'll actually talk about a use case around microsegmentation. We'll also talk about a use case around moving and automation around being able to provide everything an application stack needs, right? So the layer 2 context, the layer 3 routing, the layer 4 policy enforcement, and layer 4 through 7 services as well too. And I'll actually give you a customer example on how we went about doing that. And the last one, we'll actually talk about application continuity with one of my customers here out of Massachusetts, Bay State Health. We'll talk about how we actually built an active data center facility across 3 data centers. So obviously, very similar to what VMware brought to server virtualization, right? VMware essentially allowed you to abstract the underlying hardware, put a software layer on top, and run any operating system. So the same holds true with NSX, right? You can think of it as being a network-based hypervisor. So removing that, or providing that abstraction layer, removing the complexity of the underlying hardware, such that you can build on top of that. And with NSX, we can essentially build advanced services. So everything an application stack needs, layer 2 context, layer 2 switching, routing functionality, OSPF, BGP, advanced services, load balancing, policy enforcement, and the like as well too. And if we can essentially spin this out via RESTful APIs, then we can start leveraging automation overall, right? So I can start building out complete network stacks, application stacks within the context of my data center. When I no longer need that application stack, I can decommission that through a self-service catalog as well too, and it goes right back to the resource pool. All right, so just a quick snapshot of where we're at. So these numbers are actually from VMworld. So we announced publicly in August timeframe that we're over 700 plus customers. Again, these are back from August. Over 65 of those customers have been customers that have invested over $1 million in NSX technology overall, right? And out of that 700 plus customers, over 150 of them have actually been deployed in real production, mission critical networks, right? So we're not talking dev workloads, we're not talking R&D workloads, we're actually talking about mission critical environments overall. So where are we going next? Let me pull this out. So we've expanded our security footprint, right? We've expanded our security integration with partners. Third-party ecosystem has grown exponentially. So folks like Palo Alto, for instance, integrate directly into NSX. Folks like Checkpoint, Fortinet, just to name a few from a next-generation firewall perspective. Folks like Trend, Symantec, and folks like Rapid7 from guest introspection services as well. We've also done deeper partner integrations around top-of-rack vendors, right? So folks like Arista, Brocade, Cumulus, Dell, Force 10, HP, Intel, and the like. And then from an application continuity perspective, we've also added some additional reach, if you will, within the context of NSX. So prior to our 6.0 release, or 6.2 release, NSX was essentially tied to a single vCenter domain, which was great, but if you want to go and expand beyond multiple data centers, you're always bound by that single limitation of a single vCenter domain. So now with 6.2, NSX can actually span across up to 8 vCenters, right? So we combined that capability now with vSphere 6 and the ability to actually have multiple IP stacks and the ability now to do vMotion up to 150 milliseconds. So now our reach is expanded quite dramatically overall, right? So the realization or the possibility of doing application continuity between multiple data centers in disparate locations, even cross-country, now becomes a reality. And on top of that, I think we added something like 20 plus new feature sets into our 6.2 release as well too. More along the lines from an operations perspective, the ability to actually do a trace flow now. So, I'll give you a great example. It's Monday morning, your CEO or CTO calls you up because his application is no longer working, and you're trying to debug what's happening overall. Well, virtualization, unfortunately, added some complexity to networking and security folks, right? You didn't have that visibility of where that actual VM exists overall. Well, because we sit in the hypervisor, we essentially know the workload, we know the operating system, we know what the application profile is actually doing. We report that information up to third-party devices as well too. So in that use case where it's Monday morning, you're trying to troubleshoot why that application is no longer working, I can quickly through a central CLI, do a trace flow, and mimic that packet. So I can mimic the virtual machine from a source, I can mimic the destination, and I can see everything in the context along that path, right? So end-to-end visibility from an application perspective. All right, so let's talk about the first use case, right? So being able to do microsegmentation, right? How difficult is microsegmentation? So here's the cool thing. With microsegmentation, right, you can start leveraging NSX today without changing anything at all within the context of your data center. So your existing VLANs, your existing security zones that you currently have in place, you can leverage NSX on top of that without having to change anything, right? So extremely non-disruptive, if you will. So customer use case. So this specific customer essentially wanted to, we all see the same thing probably from day to day, right? We can spin up a virtual machine in a matter of minutes, but we have to wait for the networking team to actually provision the right VLANs, the right IP addresses. We need to wait for the security team to actually put in the right map into the right security zones, apply the right policies as well too. So for a lot of our customers, this adds to the delay, right? And if we want to move at the speed of business, especially when it comes to security, this specific customer wanted to be able to have that same feature functionality of being able to spin up a new workload and automate the security footprint overall. So compounding the matter was this customer had multiple workloads across 2 different data centers, right? So some of these workloads were production workloads, some of these were non-production workloads, and more importantly, some of these were PCI workloads, right? And we wanted to make sure that we had a PCI container around it as well too. And even more complexity was there was this whole entire shared services infrastructure, right? So anytime a new application came online, we had to map out those new applications back to the shared services infrastructure, right? So it just added to time overall. And from a high-level goal perspective, right, they wanted to provide a little bit more granularity in the way they were actually segmenting their apps overall. They wanted to simplify the way they were actually accessing shared services for new workloads coming online. And they also wanted to automate the app so that anytime they spin up a brand new app, it automatically gets mapped to the right security zone, to the right policies, has the right enforcement, regardless of where it exists, either the primary data center or the secondary. So, some of the challenges. First and foremost, this customer wanted to make sure that not only were we had security around the context of virtual machines, but it also had to be mobile aware, right? So this customer had VDI, this customer had mobile devices as well too. Also wanted to make sure that any assets that were being accessed from remote entities, such as a laptop, an iPad, or the like, essentially was able to be mapped out securely to the data center. Second aspect was around automation, right? We talked about shared services. Prior to NSX, every time a new workload came out, there was a whole host of work from a security perspective to map out all those new applications to shared services. And the third was this had to work across multiple sites. And the last, this had to be a PCI compliant environment as well too. So how do we go about, And the third was they wanted to make sure that whatever platform they decided on from a security perspective had to integrate with next generation technologies, right? So the ability to actually do deeper packet inspection, forensics if you will, or be able to take an application and peel it off to a sandbox. All right, so how do we actually go about doing this? So first and foremost, and this is something I see common in a lot of our customers, right? A lot of our customers understand the need to provide that level of microsegmentation. The problem that we run into though, is when we actually start going around and putting microsegmentation in place is most of those applications may have been built 3, 5, 6, 8 years ago, right? And so a lot of customers don't necessarily know the application profiles of those individual apps overall. So we needed essentially to partner with one of our partners that could provide that level in application profiling, if you will. So that was the first thing we started off with, right? We started thinking about how do we actually want to divide up all the workloads into groups that actually made sense, right? So we knew we had a PCI group, we knew we had dev workloads, we knew we had production workloads as well too. So we started first and foremost, by doing a little bit of analytics, if you will, right? The second thing we did is instead of reinventing the wheel every time we brought a new workload online, we wanted to essentially put a container around our shared services, right? And be able to easily map out those shared services. So now when we spin up a new environment, it automatically maps out to that shared services infrastructure, right? So we built that up. Then the third aspect was we wanted to actually leverage automation for all it was worth within the context of security, right? So if I spun up a brand new application, I wanted to make sure that my web VM essentially was mapped out to the web security group, that my application virtual machines were mapped out to the application security group, that the database was mapped out to the database security group, but more importantly, if this was a PCI app, a PCI 3-tier app, it was also mapped out to that PCI environment. So completely automated, right? Right from the central console, push a button, deploy your application. You don't have to worry about the security context because it's already embedded in that. So what did it look like after NSX? So between both data centers, we were able to logically group, even though they may be on different virtual machines, different ESXis within our environment, we were able to logically group our PCI environment, our production environments, our non-production environments, and shared services as well too. And we were able to automate that such that anytime a new workload came online, it automatically got mapped out to the correct security zone, right? So what do we use to actually deliver this? So we started off with NSX to provide distributed firewall capabilities. We leveraged vRealize for automation, right? So VRAC. And then for third-party support, remember I talked about how we were actually doing analytics, being able to understand what the workloads, the application profiles actually looked like. We actually used a company called Arkin Networks, so a partner of ours that actually takes the information that we provide and gives you this, what they call a microsegmentation planning tool, right? So it'll actually give you recommendations on how you may want to group your virtual machines into different security groups and what your application profiles actually look like. So you know what your common, your net known good east-to-west application profiles look like. And then for deeper packet inspection, Palo Alto, right? So PAN integrates directly with NSX. So if I need to do a deeper packet inspection or next generation firewall capabilities within my virtual data center, I can spin off and steer workloads, right? So being able to do service chaining. And lastly, for logging overall, we integrated with Splunk in this environment as well. So where are we going next with this customer? So we're going to map out certain security zones for additional forensics, if you will, deeper packet inspection around Palo Alto. We're going to be adding remote office protection with NSX as well too. And the customer is also going to now leverage a net new data center design, leveraging and optimizing it for NSX, for network virtualization. All right, so that was the micro-segmentation piece. And I mentioned before, to do micro-segmentation, there's no changes to your existing infrastructure whatsoever. You could leverage this exactly today. So let's talk about the second use case. This is around automating IT overall. So for this specific customer, this customer had a number of digital properties, right? That was the business that they were in. And on their current projected growth rate, they were looking to do 4x, essentially what they were doing in revenue now in 2015, or that was 2015, by 2020, right? And the business had to move at that same speed to be able to support that growth. Some of the challenges, first, we had in this customer environment many inconsistent tools, many different vendors in there. Networking, different network vendors, different security firewall vendors, different load balancers, different tool sets overall, which made it much more difficult to actually automate this whole entire process. Adding further complexity was they also had a managed data center, which was extremely costly and extremely slow to move. They were not getting the results that they wanted. And then when we were doing deeper analytics, if you will, within the context of their environment, we quickly found out that a lot of the business or individual lines of businesses within the business were actually going around IT off to a cloud infrastructure, right? So we wanted to bring things back in-house. All right, so why did we need NSX? So first, the customer wanted to make sure, since they already had developers that were writing directly to AWS, they wanted to make sure they had a vendor-neutral API-based infrastructure. So the vendor API, or the vendor-neutral API of choice was OpenStack, right? So this solution had to be an OpenStack environment, an OpenStack environment that can be completely vendor-neutral overall, and still had the ability to write those same APIs to a cloud-based service like AWS. Second aspect was completely wanted to automate this whole entire infrastructure. All right, so anytime they spun up a new app, they want to make sure the context around layer 2, layer 3 routing, layer 4 services, policy enforcement, 4 through 7 for load balancing, to be consistent, regardless of where it existed within the environment overall. And the third aspect is they wanted to maintain the same security footprint, if you will, between test, between dev, and production workloads. Now, how great is that, right? Because we all have dev workloads, we all have test workloads as well too, but they never actually look exactly like what we deploy in our data centers, right? Maybe it's a small top-of-rack environment where we have, maybe if you're lucky, we have a firewall, but we don't necessarily have the same rule sets. Well, if I can automate this whole entire framework and provide the consistent look and feel for all your networking attributes, all your security attributes in a dev environment or a test environment, then I'm more prone to actually find things before we actually go into production, right? The other thing is they wanted additional granularity, right, for east to west application profiles. So we did an application profile of the applications that are currently running in their data center, and realized about 78% of their applications were actually east to west application flows, and about 20 or so going northbound. And lastly, this customer was a vSphere customer, right? So they want to take advantage not only OpenStack, but also the vSphere capabilities as well. So what do? So we started off building out our data center architecture, leveraging, again, those open source, open standard, vendor-neutral APIs via OpenStack. Customer built a spine leaf architecture to take the best advantage of their new data center. We did a production rollout. Initially, this customer actually started with virtual networking context around VLANs and quickly went to overlay networks as well. We developed runbooks and a manifest for actually doing application types and rolling out those services. And we rolled out a consistent security policy for our test, our dev, and production workloads as well. And then when we went live, we did a whole host of testing, right? And we actually moved workloads from that hosted environment into our environment as well. And the other thing is we leveraged OpenStack with NSX and vRealize suite. So components that we used. So from a networking perspective, NSX provided distributed switching, distributed routing, distributed firewalling capabilities, and edge services gateways. For VMware integration, right, we leverage VIO. So VMware integrated OpenStack, so you get the best of both worlds, right? You get the ability to actually have HA, DRS, all that goodness you get from vSphere anyway, but now leverage that in an OpenStack environment. And then for analytics, we actually partnered with Gigamon, right? Gigamon's a great NetFlow IPFix collector, right, to do network telemetry and the like. And where are we going next? So now the intent is to expand this project to add in new lines of businesses overall into this net new environment that we built, to build out a global data center, one on the West Coast as well too, right? Now expand that reach. So as mentioned before, right, with vSphere 6, now vMotion, the management of assets can go up to 150 milliseconds. That's huge, right? That's cross-country functionality that we now have. So the third use case, this is actually my customer. This is Bay State Health, right? So I'm very near and dear to this environment. So for challenges, we had a number of data centers. Actually 3. The picture depicts 2, but there was 3 data centers overall. And we wanted to take advantage of the 3 data centers and the ability to actually burst things out to the cloud as well too, but still maintain that same infrastructure, right? Automate this overall and be able to provide true application continuity. And the vision was, from the CTO's perspective and CIO, was they want to have an always on, always available, any application from anywhere type of philosophy when they built out their infrastructure 2.0, right? Essentially, this was to provide mission critical 24/7 healthcare applications. And I'll let one of the folks from Veritech, who's one of our partners on Bay State, actually do a quick talk on this. If I can find my cursor.
If we could heavily virtualize the environment, our footprint reduced dramatically. We had dark fiber between 3 of the data centers, and we could leverage that sub 1 millisecond latency to actually create one large virtual data center, rather than building out another one with all the physical equipment that you would expect. We could dramatically reduce that and actually create something that isn't just a disaster recovery data center, but a full, high availability, always on set of data centers. The technologies that were coming out literally as we were doing the project allowed us to do that. Things like NSX, which allowed us to stretch the network across the 3 data centers seamlessly, just didn't exist several years ago. Technologies such as vSAN that lets us stretch the storage across all 3 data centers. With VMware, it's in its infancy right now, but it meets all of our needs. It's the exact solution that we needed to pull this off.
So what are the components we actually used to deploy Bay State overall, right? So obviously NSX to provide that context of around virtual networking, right? So the context around distributed switching, routing functionality, the ability to actually stretch layer 2 context between multiple data centers, the ability to actually stretch routing infrastructure between data centers as well too. From a VMware integration perspective, right? Obviously this was a vSphere shop, but more importantly, they took advantage of vSAN, right? So they're able to have multiple shared storage clusters that were shared across all 3 of their data centers overall. And then from a third partner support, we also leverage their existing F5 implementation as well. So what does this actually look like? So I think this is pretty cool, right? Of course, this is my customer, so I'm going to say that. But what we ended up building is 3 separate data centers, right? So 3 net new data centers, and we built a distributed logical router, a set of distributed logical routers that span across all 3 sites. We've built logical switches, so an L2 context across all 3 sites as well too. So beneath this was also vSAN to provide that shared storage component, if you will, between all 3 data centers so that any workload essentially could map to that same shared storage infrastructure regardless if it was in data center A, B, or C. Now from a northbound perspective, we created NSX edges, and those NSX edges spoke directly to the physical network infrastructure, and we leveraged things like ECMP and lower timers overall, right? To the point where essentially, if I lost a physical router or a physical link, convergence time for that specific data center was less than 6 seconds overall, right? So pretty remarkable. The other thing is we provided a common transit network throughout that whole entire environment. So essentially what we built here is by leveraging things such as fault domains and rack awareness. We took rack awareness now, but we applied it to the context of a data center, right? So from a high level perspective, the assets or workloads that I created or we create in data center A have an HA pair in data center B. The workloads that we create in data center B have an HA pair in data center C, C and back to A as well too, right? So you're taking, we're taking DR to the next level, if you will, right? By providing that layer of application continuity overall. And then how do we start? I'll build this out here real quick. So first of all, we actually started off by building this in a full mesh. So as opposed to a spine leaf architecture, since we're talking 3 sites, we built a full mesh leveraging OSPF. We chose vSAN for storage, right, across metro distances. And then we had NSX provide all the context for all the networking, all the security, all the advanced services, routing functionality, load balancing, the like. When we went actually to build this out, we actually rolled this out with layer 3 for our VTEPs, right, so our overlays, if you will. But more importantly, layer 3 for vSAN as well too. So for the first time, we were actually doing vSAN across layer 3. So we were leveraging IP multicast to essentially communicate across all 3 different areas, all 3 different data centers, but yet still have a common set of shared storage volumes, if you will, between those 3 sites. And we diligently tested, creating workloads, deleting workloads, moving workloads, and found that the application and what we built was extremely resilient, and it worked exactly the way we thought it would work. And then we started building out run books, so make sure that as we operationalize this whole entire environment, their ops team essentially had a run book to go along with. And where are we going next with Bay State? So we're going to expand the security footprint now to essentially include VDI, right? So NSX obviously integrates directly into our data centers, but it also integrates with things like Vue or even Citrix for that matter from a VDI perspective, right? If I can authenticate a user based on that user's credentials, understand this user may be a third-party developer, for instance, then I can map that specific VDI instance to a portion of the data center. Maybe that portion of the data center is a dev environment and lock that contractor only into the dev environment and not into the production environment, right? So taking it a step further. And then lastly, what we're going to be doing is actually doing third-party service insertion. So this customer is actually going right now, doing their due diligence on some of the ecosystem partners for next-generation firewall technologies. All right, so we talked about 3 different customer deployment scenarios, right? How the challenges and what we actually did to overcome those challenges. So now we'll talk about how we're taking it to the next level, right? As I mentioned before, 2015 for us pretty much proved that NSX went mainstream, given the fact that we've seen such a mass deployment across a broad spectrum of different customers, solving a broad spectrum of different use cases and problems as well, if you will. So we also added a whole host of operational features into this platform. So tools. So let's face it, we have an unfair advantage, if you will, because of the fact we actually sit on the hypervisor and the kernel of the hypervisor. So from a virtual networking perspective, we understand what the underlying workloads are doing, what the underlying applications are doing as well too. So now we're providing that context now, not only to our own tool sets, but also to third-party tools that are out there as well to provide end-to-end troubleshooting visibility. So native capabilities in the platform include things like our NSX-based APIs, syslogging capabilities, IPFix, right? For those of you that may not know, IPFix and NetFlow are essentially the same protocol now. Port mirroring capabilities, SNMP, traceflow, and much, much more. And that ecosystem I talked about earlier includes folks like Arkin Networks, right? One of the vendors I talked about earlier that has that ability to actually have intrinsics into our network, understand what application profiles actually look like from a microsegmentation planning perspective. Our own vRealize operations suite, obviously, Log Insights, obviously as well too, but we also integrate with Splunk. We also integrate with Gigamon to be able to provide telemetry, NetScout as well too for telemetry information. And then for management, Riverbed, Tufin for compliance, area compliance around security, and then HITRUST to deliver additional levels of RBAC functionality. Now, maintaining SLAs. So we've actually done a whole host of work over the past year. We now have run books. We now have operational run books. We now have best reference architecture design guides for integrating in an Arista platform, integrating into a Cisco platform, integrating into UCS, integrating into Dell. The list goes on and on and on. So we've grown that out exponentially. And most of this is because of the community, folks like yourselves, that have essentially helped us build out the best infrastructure, leverage lessons learned, and now we're publishing those, and you expect to see more as we move forward. Lastly, around people, right? We actually have a whole entire training program built around NSX capabilities. It starts with the VCP NV, so network virtualization VCP. It goes to the VCIX, and ultimately the VCDX as well too. We've trained a whole host of our partners, a whole host of our customers as well too, so this community is growing rapidly. I kind of hit on this already, but from our perspective, right, NSX is mainstream at this point. Just given the fact that we've crossed so many different customer segments, across so many different use cases overall, right? We've seen this deployed in a number of fashions, and we're actually doing mission critical network infrastructure, right? So we talked about microsegmentation, but other use cases abound, especially around when we talk about DMZ or securing end user as well too. So we talked about VDI, securing VDI. How about taking NSX and actually securing mobile devices, right? So combining NSX with AirWatch. So now I can actually maintain that layer of security, that granularity of security with mobile devices or even VDI devices for that matter, right? Around DR. So I talked about the fact that now we can actually extend our reach up to 150 milliseconds, right? Which gives us greater reach overall from a vCenter perspective or cross vCenter perspective. It also allows us to integrate directly with SRM. So if I'm building out the layer 2 context, right, and I can stretch out a layer 2 between multiple data centers, I can also add in the logical routing between my data centers as well too, right? From a pure DR scenario, right, the bulk of the time in a DR scenario is your application goes down, you bring up your application in your protected site, or your DR site I should say, and you bring up all those virtual machines and you have to re-IP all the underlying virtual machines. Well, that adds time. Well, if I have the same context, the same layer 2 networking, the same routing across both of them, I can actually move that application now to my DR site, and I don't have to re-IP that whole entire application suite, which essentially means that I get about an 80% reduction in RTO time overall, right? And with that, we integrate directly into SRM, making things a lot easier for our customers. And then cloud. So for some of you folks that may have been at VMworld this year, we actually showed running NSX within the context of a container-based infrastructure. We also showed how we could leverage NSX security in AWS as well too. So expect more from that. That was a preview. Expect more of that to come this year as well. All right, so what's next? So a number of things. If you're interested in learning more about NSX, there's a whole entire spectrum of resources that are out there. I talked about some of the reference architecture guides, the best practice guides, the operational guides that are out there as well too. But leverage the HOL, right? For those of you that may be familiar with the HOL, it's a lab environment you can spin up at your leisure. You can go to any specific module. So if you want to learn specifically around how NSX does BGP or how NSX does OSPF or how we handle load balancing or SSL pass-through for a few examples, you can log into the HOL, go to that specific module, if you will, that specific lab and that specific module, and actually at your own leisure do it. And for guys like me, I have a short attention span, right? It's fantastic because they're delved up in like chunks of 20, 30, 45-minute lab environments, right? So great overall. And then start talking to your NSX team, right? We're more than happy to talk to you folks about how we can actually help you overcome some of the business challenges you're currently facing as well too. And then join our community, right? We have a whole entire community of folks that are putting up some of the best ideas out there right now. And with that, thank you. Any questions? All right. Go Pats.